Hi, I'm David Barry from View Weekly, and today we're going to be taking a bit of a tour of some of the prints entered in the international print competition for SNAP's Edmonton Print International. We're going to be touring around with Walter Jule, who sat on the jury and is sort of the dean of printmakers here in Edmonton. He founded the U of A's printmaking program back in the 1970s, and he's been the elder statesman for the program ever since. So I hope you enjoy it. I hope you learn something. And yeah, we'll get to the prints. This is the first print we're looking at. Tell me where it's from, who did it, yeah, that sort of stuff.
Well, these are two photo etchings by a Japanese artist named Ryoji Ikeda. And what's interesting about these, I think, is that they follow on a tradition that builds on the integration of photography with printmaking that started way back when Andy Warhol and pop artists in the United States started shoving silkscreens on canvas. What happened, though, between then and now in the evolution of photography is that the Japanese and the Eastern Europeans, while they picked up on the techniques, they didn't pick up on that kind of pop flavor. Their take was much more culturally inflected, and you can see in these prints, they're so dark, almost like night scenes, and you can make out a little pathway in the forest, a ritualistic circle of flames glistening on a desolate beach. The Japanese really looked at photography and printmaking like they looked at haiku poetry or kind of ancient symbolic forms. And so photography in Japanese printmaking has become almost a kind of, well, mournful might be going a little too far, but a kind of serious, deep meditation on what Ryoji Ikeda calls the point at which life and death desire each other. So I could show you, let me show you another example of the ways in which photography has been inflected by Asian artists. This artist is Tadayoshi Nakabayashi, a kind of elder statesman now of Japanese printmaking, just a few years older than Ryoji Ikeda, but from the same generation. At the beginning of the Second World War, his family moved him to the Japanese Alps, what they call Japanese snow country, to be safe from the Tokyo bombing. And so he grew up there until he was about 11 or 12 years old. And as in Alberta, the winters there are marked by this pure graphic reality of black and white, the tree trunks and the snow. Afterwards, when he started his career as a printmaker, he tried all kinds of pop imagery with this technique, photo etching, with comets coming down and landing on, with nude women running away from catastrophes and all that kind of stuff. But slowly, over about 10 or 15 years, all the very literal references kind of disappeared. And he zoomed in really at the ground at his feet, the leaves and the stark contrast, and taking them so far, punctuating them with these kind of sliding value tones, that they really hover between a literal kind of image and a pure abstraction. But still we sense the kind of, organization, the organic jumble of a kind of natural environment.
How much does sort of the printmakers really sort of fight for that literal interpretation, and how much do they kind of drift away from it and try to make it something, just a bit more abstract?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's probably the most pivotal question about photography and printmaking, because in normal photography, and in a way in new digital techniques, the photographic image is mediated, you might say, by the darkroom processes or by the digital file. But there's not, or at least the idea is that there's as less interruption as possible between the initial recognition of the photographic subject and its presentation to the audience. But printmaking's different, because through photomechanical process, the print has to go from something seen to something recorded on film, and then something that is etched or drawn or pulled or manipulated into a stable print matrix. In the two cases we just looked at, etched into a copper plate with acid. So in that process, there's what photographers would call a loss of detail and resolution. And this shift represents a multi-dimensional loss of resolution, because the etching process is not precise and gives the photograph, it pushes the photograph from a pure illusion to something that hovers between a visual illusion and the experience of a surface, of a space, like a stone wall or something patinaed with actual dimension. So the requirement for the viewer becomes different. To enjoy one of these prints, we're caught almost simultaneously having to feel the illusion of space presented by the photographic image, however shallow that might be. But at the same time, our tactile response is to be aware of the actual surface of the print. So in a way, we have to kind of read this in two kind of opposing ways at the same time. It's an illusion and it's a fact. It's somewhere else, but it got here because it was brought through the physicality of a plate material. Right. So that really changes the way printmakers approach photography and why photography has become, in a way, an extension of drawing, an introduction of sculptural elements into printmaking. I would argue that photography probably has become the central quality in the printmaking format that allows it to go from that and assemble all those qualities that we used to associate variously with drawing and painting and sculpture and bring them all into one even film. Right. But let's take that further with the print around the corner.
Sure thing.
Here's a print by a Korean artist that looks at the digital age straight on. He does a lot of these scenes, just people walking along on the streets of Seoul. But of course, if you look very carefully at each one of these little massaged, enlarged pixels, every little pixel in there is a little face of somebody in the crowd looking back at you. So maybe it's a comment about crowds of people that are faceless or nameless, or maybe it's kind of looking, as the Poles did and some of the British pop artists, looking at the photograph. This is the photograph back when it was printed with the Ben-Day halftone dots in newspapers, you know, right. And looking back at those dots, looking so closely at them, it's like looking at the cellular structure of something. Instead of looking at the image we see, we kind of get into the molecular structure and even into the, you might say, the DNA. So digital, in a way, is an extension of printmaking's plumbing through and digging through the facade of the photograph to find out what it makes it tick underneath. So when we look at the movement that printmakers have made, the way they've embraced digital technology, and I think some of the superficial argument that swirl around that, well, does printmaking have to redefine itself now? Did it always have to be on a plate? Can a digital printout be a print? My view would be that printmakers, since the beginning, as they incorporate new technologies, are always looking inside those technologies for that structure and then integrating that structure with previous structures.